Is your child easily overwhelmed? This is one of the most common things I hear from parents is that their children have difficulty with emotional regulation. And that could be things like having extreme anxiety over things that you shouldn't have anxiety about. It could also be things like having extreme anger or outbursts or being super reactive to things, or even crying really easily about basic things, getting really like an easy injury, nothing like major, and just having a meltdown because of it. This is probably the number one thing I hear about from parents. So we're going to talk about what reflex may be involved, as well as a couple lifestyle factors that could be involved as well. So number one, the biggest reflex I would look at for that is the Moro reflex. This is that reflex that can be triggered by a noise, by sound, by temperature, by changes in movement and changes of the head. So any sensory input can trigger this response. And this is where the baby goes, ah, and starts to cry, like opens its arms, reaches its head back, starts to cry, and eventually comes back down into a flexed position. So this reflex, when it is still unintegrated, we see kids significantly in fight or flight. So they are still in this lower level brain area that is constantly surveying the environment to see whether we're safe or not. This reflex is also much contributed to sensory issues, whether they're hypersensitive to information or hyposensitive. And that could be to tactile, to sounds, to vestibular movement, or any of those. So Moro reflex, when unintegrated, we're thinking sensory issues, we're thinking fight or flight, which could cause anxieties. So this is the reflex I would be looking at if I had a child that was easily overwhelmed, have emotional dysregulation. But of course, if this reflex is unintegrated, there are others. So you want to check the entire gamut of reflexes, or at least the core 8 reflexes that we work with using the Melillo method. So there's some factors in our lifestyle that could be contributing to this as well. So number one, processed foods, what we're putting in our body. So our gut and our brain talk to one another, and research that Dr. David Perlmutter talked about on his podcast said that when we eat processed food and junk food that our body doesn't recognize as food, it actually takes blood flow away from our prefrontal cortex, or our ability to think with our cognitive brain. And it keeps us in this fight or flight zone. So pretty amazing. So number one, food. Number two, screens, screen time. So think about screens. They keep us in this sympathetically driven world. Our sympathetic nervous system is the one with fight or flight. Parasympathetic is our rest and digest system. And we need a good balance between those two. When we are constantly being inundated with visual and auditory stimulation, which is what screens give us, and don't have vestibular or proprioceptive output, so we're not moving with it, we can't get that energy out of our body, we are gonna go into overload and we're gonna go into more fight or flight. So too much screen time. Number three, lack of movement. So again, it kind of goes with the screen time thing, but lack of movement. Our kids need to move. Parents need to move. We need to move our body to get that stress and anxiety and everything out. And that the only way to do that is by moving. So some kids that are easily overwhelmed, have all this emotional dysregulation, live in a household with parents that don't move as well. So now we're all in this stressful environment, and we're contributing to it not only with possibly an underdeveloped brain, but with our lifestyle choices as well. So to improve as much as possible, we want to work a program that helps that brain develop, but also think about our lifestyle choices and make our life a little bit less stressful and a little bit more in the parasympathetic zone of resting and less stress. And it can take a lot of work in our society, but this will help your child with their emotional regulation.